Before this video starts, I want to quickly mention that this was initially a 1 hour video, but what I've done is I've decided to split it up into 3 separate parts. That way it's a little bit more digestible to watch and it's a little bit more easier so that you don't have to focus for over an hour. The following videos after that will pretty much continue on from where it left off. So enjoy the video. Now the next one I'm going to be talking about is the exchange. The exchange is 351 lines of code. And just as it sounded, the exchange code is all about being able to exchange your food for skill points and being able to pick them up. And this is just a button essentially being triggering a function, something like eat food purple, and it would check if you've got over a certain amount, so over 1 or 1. So if it had more than 1 or equal to 1, and you had the timer under a certain amount, so if the certain player hunger was under a certain amount of, and it wasn't 100%, then you could eat. If it was 100%, you weren't able to eat, and it would just remove a fish or a food resource, and then recover a certain amount. I believe this was percentage based. And it would recover that amount equal to what the quality of the food was. So if you ate squid, then you would get more food from it. If you ate something like a jellyfish, maybe you'd probably get less. Just because it's in a different place, it's harder to get the squid. Of course, a player eat sound was also there, and if you didn't have enough, a message would come up saying you do not have enough of this item, or that you are full and cannot eat. But it still required a lot of lines of code because of the variety of items you would eat. All of these different items had their own value in terms of skill points, so you could exchange those resources for a certain amount of skill points, and it would you would then be able to spend those skill points in the skill tree. Next we have the player controller, which is 533 lines of code. The player controller is a little bit different. It is essentially controlling where you are. It allows me to track which biomes you're in, kind of what is interacting with if you're being hit by something. So there's a lot of triggers within this, the player controller, which is why it's so extensive. But there's also a lot of sounds that are played here. So if the shallows, sound clips, and the special effects, a lot of them are controlled in here and triggered in here. Because the player controller script is on the player itself, it was the best place to put it. There's a lot of controls in this player controller and references to other scripts that get that trigger in here and then get sent to other scripts to continue code. There's also the turning, which required a unique code, which was a math.lerp angles to try and get the right angles when they're spinning and turning, without it being really weird and buggy because it would spin out of control. So I'd have to calculate specific angles by a certain speed and then track what their initial angle was to be able to turn them and rotate them in a very fluent way. There was also the effects for like bubble trails, and also the player sprites changing with the sorting order when they go in the water. When they go underwater and then go on land, the sorting order actually changes, and the bubble trails turn off and on if they're in the water or not. There was a lot of timer loading and effectiveness because we had a loading icon and a saving icon also controlled in here. With all the triggers, it made it a really long script. Ultimately, the saving of where the player is, as well as if a save icon is true or not, and if they can save in a certain area, was also controlled here, because in the boss fight you can't actually save. So I also have that saved in the save and load data. Next is the player health with 612 lines of code. The player health is a very interesting one because I actually decided to create my own type of player health using the armor system, and this is very different to a lot of other games. I wanted it to be very different and control it very differently, and it meant that it had a unique frustration with it because the player had to really strategize when they hit something and really learn the amount of time they have before they're vulnerable. This is very different in my game because what I wanted was the player to actually be very careful. So when a player would hit you, your shell would actually continue breaking your armor and every time it broke, you were vulnerable to being hit. So if you got hit, you would take a ton of damage on your health. You actually had to upgrade in the skill points, using skill points in the skill tree to upgrade your armor so that it didn't continue breaking, and I think it made the skill tree really valuable. There was a lot of players that I've seen that didn't really get that far and just got frustrated with that system. So maybe I should have made it a little bit more less punishing. The system is very, very complex actually, because it's all about determining if a certain enemy is null or not, and if they are or if they aren't, and if a certain upgrade has been not bought or has been bought, then it'll do a different effect. So as you can see here, it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot of bools, there's a lot of timers, there's a lot of determining how far away a certain enemy is to be able to do damage. We also had the recovery aspect of it, where if you got to your island, it would start a recovery process, and in the skill tree there was a way of increasing the recovery timer so that it would happen quicker. But you also had poison damage and poison effects, which were triggered when you hit a specific enemy that is has a specific tag of poison, and that would trigger a special effect on your screen as well, just like how the fear has a certain effect if it hits 0. And these are all handled through triggers, so you do have a trigger for when an enemy does hit you, which helps to determine if the enemy is close. Next we have the player score. Now the player score is, as I mentioned earlier, after the player health with 612 lines of code, it was the player score, which is 443 lines of code. And this one's actually very simple to explain. It just controls all the different integers and the different text control that is in the top bar. So the resource bar, which has all of the food balls, as well as the resource like fish and things, that it controls the text of that, the storage number, as well as the individual resource number, and it tracks all of that so that you can save it and load it whenever we need. This also has the triggers for when you hit those specific items in the world. So if you hit a specific item, and because this is on the player, it's fine to use, when they run into a specific item, it adds it to that that overall score, and then they can use that in the exchange. But it also triggers the collection for the player objectives, increasing a certain amount of fish towards a certain objective as well. The other aspect is the back to life functionality, which is when you come back to life in the afterlife section of the map in that biome, then you it triggers a certain function which turns all of your current stats into 0 that you have, and then sets you also then lose a skill point, 1 skill point, every time you come back. You also have your positioning reset and your home beacon set, and of course your sorting and your hunger timer. The next one is the food ball system, which is the consumables. The bottom left you have like a UI in your player HUD which has different controls. So you can activate a food ball if you have one and you've crafted them. So if you've crafted them, you'll have them available at the bottom left, and you can go through them. And if you have it available, you can activate it. Now the food ball system determines what kind of buffs you have, what controls, how long certain lasts for, and what effect they do. So if we look at the code, we have our basic bars controlling, which is the charge bars when the ball is ready and when it isn't, and they get and we have certain bools and controls to determine how long it lasts, which do get overwritten depending on what the buffs are and what the timers are. These buffs also change based on the skill tree, so in the crafting section, and determine how long certain ones last for. So there are 7 food balls in the game, at least in the base game, not in the expansion, and this is the things like increase in hunger, getting an extra shield bar so that you can take more hits. You have the night vision, which I mentioned earlier, increases the distance you can see. You have the damage, extra damage when you bite something, using that ability. You also have the shield break, which slows down its breaking. You also have the immunity, which means you won't take any damage on your health. Even if you lose all of your shields, you will be immune. Then you have the cooldown, which is the strongest, which decreases the cooldown on your abilities, so the teleport, the boost, and the bite, which is very, very useful in the boss fight. So food ball was controlled by a specific number, and every time you switch between by pressing a specific button, it would then change the integer and change the number. And depending on what the number was would determine what a specific game object was on or off, and that was the icon, as well as if a certain bool was true. If the certain bool was true, then that would be selected, and you would also be able to see the name changing as well when you're switching. There had to be a wait amount of time in order to switch them, so that players just couldn't spam through and accidentally go past. So there's a slight waiting, as well as the consuming of control if certain ones are actually true, certain bools are true, and if they have a certain amount. Now, of course, depending on what skills you had would determine if you the percentage increase, and what actually happens with them is controlled in here as well. So when they consume it, a function is then played that's associated with them, which starts an effect, and these effects have certain changes certain times left, and that counts down all the way to the amount, as well as and the time left is actually determined by those skills that we've potentially upgraded. When an effect happens, it is determined by what kind of food you're actually eating. So some things are immediately activated, while others actually happen when the food ball finishes, and this all depends on what you're actually consuming. Now, the final big aspects of code is the Arka boss battle fight. This was 1022 lines of code, by far the biggest script in the game with the most lines of code, and it makes sense considering how much it controls. So this controls the entire boss fight. It's essentially the Arka boss battle manager, and it determines all the different animation states and all the different animations that play, all the different effects coming off the Arka when they're fighting, and where the player is in that fight, what stages we're at, how much health should activate what. It's a very, very complex script, but determining what amount of health it has determines what battle state it's in, and what battle state determines what. At random, it chooses then what type of attack to do, whether it's the whirlpool attack, the tail whip attack, or something like the bash attack, or the different effects. So, and these are chosen completely at random. So you have the whirlpool attack, the sweep attack, and the wave attack. These are chosen completely at random depending on what stage they're in, and what battle stage also increases the rarity of certain ones, while also increasing the difficulty of each stage. So a new set of difficulties then added, which increases the amount of, say, wave spawning, or the amount of enemies like baby Arkas that spawn that attack the player, or even it makes the whirlpool even harder to escape and take more damage from. This is all determined in this script. So you also have like I mentioned before, what happens throughout the boss fight, but also when the fight ends, so the cutscene at the very end, and also determines what the state of the environment looks like when you're fighting, and post and before the fight as well. So post fight and before the fight. So coming up to defeating the very first Arka, you then get a whirlpool you can enter. That is controlled in here if that screen pops up, and if you have a certain amount, you can go in deactivating the saves and stuff, which triggered in the player controller. It all starts here. What waves are controlled as well, what spawns enemies in the certain waves, and again what difficulty the boss fight goes through is all determined in here as well. What animation plays, whether it's unprotected or protected and attacking, whether your bite effect can actually do anything, and also when the whale is actually vulnerable is determined in here as well. Finally, we have the effects at the end, the animations at the end with the final end cutscene. Also the exit opening up to be able to finish the game.